Well, welcome back to the reading of Echo Park. We're on part 1, chapter 3. Back at Open Unsolved, they sat in their supervisor's office and brought him up to date on the day's development. Abel Pratt was 4 weeks away from retirement after 25 years on the job. He was attentive to them, but not overly so. On the side of his desk was a stack of folders, guidebooks for Caribbean islands. His plan was to pull the pin, leave the city, and find an island to live on with his family. It was a common retirement dream among law enforcement officers to pull back from all the darkness witnessed for so long on the job. The reality, however, was that after about 6 months on the beach, the island got pretty boring. A Detective 3 from RHD named David Lampkin was set to be the squad's top after Pratt split. He was a naturally recognized sex crimes expert chosen for the job because so many of the cold cases they were working in the unit were sexually motivated. Bosch was looking forward to working with him and would have liked to be briefing him instead of Pratt, but the timing was off. They went with who they had, and one of the positive things about Pratt was that he was going to give them free rein until he was out the door. He just didn't want any waves, no blowback in his face. He wanted a quiet, uneventful last month on the job. Like most cops with 25 years in the department, Pratt was a throwback. He was old school. He preferred working on a typewriter over a computer. Rolled halfway up in the IBM Selectric. Next to his desk was a letter he had been working on when Bosch and Ryder stepped in. Bosch had grabbed a quick glance at it while he was sitting down and saw it was a letter to a casino in the Bahamas. Pratt was trying to line up a security gig in Paradise, and that about said it all when it came to where his mind was at these days. After hearing their briefing, Pratt gave his approval for them to work with O'Shea and only become animated when he issued a warning about Renard Watts' attorney, Maury Swan. "Let me tell you about Maury," Pratt said. "Whatever you do when you meet him, do not shake his hand." "Why not?" Ryder asked. "I had a case with him once. This is way back. It was a gangbanger on a 1887. Every day when he started court, Maury made a big deal of shaking my hand and then the prosecutor's. He probably would have shaken the judge's hand too, if he'd gotten the chance. So after his guy was convicted, he tried to get a reduced sentence by snitching out the others involved in the murder. One of the things he told me during the debriefing was that he thought I was dirty. He said that during the trial, Maury had told him he could buy all of us. Me, the prosecutor, everybody. So the banger had his homegirl get him the cash, and Maury explained to him that every time he was shaking our hands, he was paying us off. You know, passing the cash palm to palm. He always did those two-handed shakes too. He was really selling it to his guy, while all along he was keeping the cash." "Holy shit," Ryder exclaimed. "Didn't you guys work up a case on him?" Pratt dismissed the idea with a wave. "It was after the fact, and besides, it was a bullshit. He said case. It wouldn't have gone anywhere. Not with Maury being a member of the bar in good standing and all." But ever since then, I heard that Maury likes shaking hands a lot. So when you get in that room with him and Watts, don't shake his hand." They left Pratt's office, smiling at the story, and returning to their own workstation. The division of labor had been worked out on their walk back from the courthouse. Bosch would take Watts, and Ryder would take Fitzpatrick. They would know the files inside and out by the time they sat across the table from Watts in the interview room the following day. Since Ryder had less to read in the Fitzpatrick case, she also would finish the filing on Materis. This meant Bosch was cleared to study full-time the world of Renard Watts. After pulling out the Fitzpatrick file for Ryder, he chose to take the accordion folder O'Shea had given them down to the cafeteria. He knew the lunch crowd would be thinning out, and he would be able to spread the files out and work without the distractions of the constantly ringing phones and chatter of the open, unsolved squad room. He had to use a napkin to clean a table in the corner, but then quickly settled into his review of the materials. There were 3 files on Watts. They included the LAPD murder book compiled by Olivius and Ted Colbert, his partner in the Northeast Division Homicide Squad, a file on a prior arrest, and the prosecution file compiled by O'Shea. Bosch decided to read the murder book first. He quickly became acquainted with Reynard Watts and the details of his arrest. The suspect was 34 years old and lived in a ground floor apartment on Switzer Avenue in West Hollywood. He wasn't a large man, standing 5'6" and weighing 142 pounds. He was the owner-operator of a one-man business, a residential window cleaning company called Clearview Residential Glass Cleaners. According to the police report, he came to the attention of 2 patrol officers, a boot named Arnolfo Gonzalez and his training officer, Ted Fennell, at 1:50 a.m. on a night of May 11th. The officers were assigned a crime response team which was watching a hillside neighborhood in Echo Park because of a recent rash of home burglaries that had been occurring on the nights of Dodgers home games. Though in a uniform, Gonzalez and Fennell were in an unmarked cruiser near the intersection of Stadium Way and Chavez Ravine Place. Bosch knew the location. It was at the remote edge of the Dodger Stadium complex and above the Echo Park neighborhood that the CRT teams were watching. He also knew that they were following a standard CRT strategy to stay out of the perimeter of the target neighborhood and follow in any vehicle or persons who looked suspicious or out of place. According to the report filed by Gonzalez and Fennell, they grew suspicious as to why a van marked on the sides with the signs that said Clearview Residential Glass Cleaners was out and about at 2 in the morning. They followed at a distance, and Gonzalez used night vision binoculars to get the van's plate number. He then entered it into the car's mobile digital terminal, the officers choosing to use the onboard computer rather than the radio in case the burglar working in the neighborhood was equipped with a police radio scanner. The computer kicked back a flag. The plate was registered to a Ford Mustang with an address in Claremont. Believing that the license plate on the van was stolen and that they now had probable cause to stop it, Fennell accelerated, put on the UC car's grill lights, and stopped the van on Figueroa Terrace near the intersection of Boudry Avenue. The driver of the vehicle appeared agitated and leaned out of the van's window to talk to Officer Gonzalez. An effort to block the officer from conducting a visual survey of the interior of the vehicle. The arrest summary read, Officer Fennell approached the vehicle's passenger side and beamed his flashlight into the van without entering the vehicle. Officer Fennell was able to notice that what appeared to be several black plastic trash bags on the floorboard in front of the front passenger seat of the vehicle. A substance appearing to be blood could be seen leaking from the cinched mouth of one of the bags and onto the floor of the van. According to the report, the driver was asked if that was blood leaking from one of the bags, and he stated that he had cut himself earlier in the day when a large plate glass window he was cleaning shattered. He stated that he had used several glass cleaning rags to clean up the blood. When asked to show where he was cut, the driver smiled and then suddenly made a move to restart the vehicle's ignition. Officer Gonzalez reached through the window to restrain him. After a short struggle, the driver was removed from the vehicle and placed on the ground and handcuffed. He was then moved to the back seat of the unmarked car. Officer Fennell opened the vehicle and inspected the bags. At this time, Officer Fennell found the first bag he opened containing human body parts. Investigative units were immediately summoned to the scene. The driver's license of the man taken out of the van identified him as Renard Watts. He was booked into the holding tank at Northeast Division while an investigation of his van and the plastic trash bags carried on through the night on Figueroa Terrace. Only after detectives Olivis and Colbert, the on-call team that night, took over the investigation and retracted some of the steps taken by Gonzalez and Fennell, was it learned that the rookie officer had typed the wrong license plate number into the MDT, typing an F for an E and getting the plate registration for the Mustang out in Claremont. In law enforcement terms, it was a good faith error, meaning the probable cause to have stopped the van should still hold because the officer had been acting in good faith when an honest mistake was committed. Bosch assumed that this was the point of the appeal Rick O'Shea had mentioned earlier. Bosch put aside the murder investigation file and opened the prosecution file. He quickly looked through the documents until he found a copy of the appeal. He scanned it quickly and found what he had expected. Watts was claiming that typing in the wrong plate number was a custom and practice within the LAPD, and often employed when officers on specialty squad wanted to pull over a search a vehicle without legitimate probable cause to do so. Though a Superior Court judge found that Gonzalez and Fennell had acted on good faith and upheld the legality of the search, Watts was appealing that decision to the District Courts of Appeal. Bosch went back to the investigation file. No matter the question of the legality of the traffic stop, the investigation of Renard Watts had moved rapidly. The morning after the arrest, Olivis and Colbert obtained a search warrant for the apartment on Switzer where Watts lived alone. A 4-hour search and forensics examination of the apartment produced several samples of human hair and blood taken from the bathroom's sink and tub traps, as well as a hidden space beneath the floor containing several pieces of women's jewelry and multiple Polaroid photos of nude young women who appeared to be sleeping, unconscious or dead. And the utility room was an upright freezer which was empty, except for the 2 samples of pubic hair found by an SID tech. Meantime, the 3 plastic bags found in the van had been transported to the coroner's office and opened. They were found to contain the body parts of 2 young women, each of whom had been strangled and dismembered after death in the same way. Of note was the fact that the parts from one of the bodies showed indications of having been thawed after being frozen. Though no cutting tools were found in Watts' apartment or van, it was clear from the evidence gathered that while Officer Gonzalez and Fennell were looking for a burglar, they had stumbled onto what appeared to be a serial killer at work. The belief was that Watts had already discarded or hidden his tools and was in the process of disposing of the body of 2 of the victims when he drew the attention of the CRT officers. The indications were that there might be other victims as well. The reporters in the file detailed the efforts made in the next several weeks to identify the 2 bodies as well as the other women in the Polaroids found in the apartment. Watts, of course, offered no help in this regard, engaging the services of Maury Swan on the morning of his capture and choosing to remain silent as the law enforcement processes continued and Swan mounted an attack on the probable cause of the traffic stop. Only one of the 2 known victims was identified. Fingerprints taken from one of the dismembered women drew a hit on the FBI's latest latent database. She was identified as 17-year-old runaway from Davenport, Iowa. Lindsay Mathers had left home 2 months before being found in Watts' van and had not been heard from during that time by her parents. With photos supplied by her mother, detectives were able to piece together her trail in Los Angeles. She was recognized by youth counselors at several Hollywood shelters. She had been using a variety of names to avoid being identified and possibly sent home. There were indications she was involved in drug use and street prostitution. Needle marks found on her body during the autopsy were believed to have been the result of a long and ongoing practice of injecting drugs. A blood screen taken during the autopsy found heroin and PCP in her bloodstream. The shelter counselors who helped identify Lindsay Mathers were also shown the Polaroid photographs found in Watts' apartment and were able to provide a variety of different names for at least 3 of the women. Their stories were similar to Mathers' journey. They were runaways, possibly engaged in prostitution as a means of earning money for drugs. It was clear to Bosch from the gathered evidence and information that Watts was a predator who targeted young women who would not be immediately missed. Fringe dwellers who were unaccounted for by society in the first place and therefore not missed when they disappeared. The Polaroids from the hidden space in Watts' apartment were in the file, encased in a plastic sheet, 4 to a page. There were 8 pages with multiple shots of each woman. An accompanying analysis report stated that the photo collection contained shots of 9 different women. The 2 women whose remains were found in Watts' van and 7 unknown. Bosch knew that the unknowns were likely to be the 7 women Watts was offering to tell authorities about, in the addition to Maury Gesto, Marie Gesto and the pawn shop man, but he studied the photos anyways for the face of Marie Gesto. She wasn't there. The faces in the photos belonged to women who had not caused the same sort of stir that Marie Gesto had. Bosch sat back and took off his reading glasses to rest his eyes for a few moments. He remembered one of his earlier teachers in homicide, Detective Ray Van, had a special sympathy for the ones he called murderers nobodies, the victims who didn't count. He taught Bosch early on that in society all victims are not created equal, but to the true detective they must be. Every one of them was somebody's daughter. Ray Van had told him. Every one of them counted. Bosch rubbed his eyes. He thought about Watts' offer to clear up 9 murders, including Marie Gesto's and Daniel Fitzpatrick's, and those of 7 women who never caused a blip on anybody's radar. Something seemed not right about that. Fitzpatrick was an abnormal because he was a male and the killing didn't appear to be sexually motivated. He had always assumed that Marie Gesto was a sex killing, but she was not a throwaway victim. She had hit the radar big time. Had Watts learned from her? Had he honed his craft after her killing to make sure he never drew such police and media heat again? Bosch thought that maybe the heat he had applied on the Gesto case was what caused Watts to change, to become a more skilled and cunning killer. If that was so, then he would have to deal with that guilt at a later time. For now, he had to focus on what was in front of him. He put his glasses on again and went back to the files. The evidence against Watts was solid. Nothing like being caught in possession of body parts. A defense attorney's nightmare. A prosecutor's dream. The case sailed through a preliminary hearing in 4 days, and then the DA's office upped the ante, with O'Shea announcing he would go for the death penalty. Bosch had a legal pad to the side of the open file so that he could write down questions for O'Shea, Watts, or others. It was blank when he came to the end of his review of the investigation and prosecution files. He now wrote the only question that came to mind. If Watts killed Gesto, why was there no photo of her in his apartment? Watts lived in West Hollywood. What was he doing in Echo Park? The first question could be easily explained. Bosch knew killers evolved. Watts could have learned from the Gesto killing that he needed reminders of his work. The photos could have started after Gesto. The second question was more troubling to him. There was no report in the file that dealt with this question. It was thought simply that Watts had been on his way to get rid of the bodies, possibly to bury them in the parklands that surrounded Dodger Stadium. No further investigation of this was contemplated or called for. But to Bosch, it was something to consider. Echo Park would have been at least a half-hour away car from Watts' apartment in West Hollywood. That was a long time to be driving with body parts and bags. Additionally, Griffith Park, which was larger and had more pockets of isolation and difficult terrain than the area around the stadium, was far closer to the West Hollywood apartments and would have been the better choice for a body dump. To Bosch, it meant that Watts had a specific destination in mind in Echo Park. This had been missed and dismissed as unimportant in original investigation. He next wrote 2 words: psych profile. No psychological study of the defendant had been conducted, and Bosch was mildly surprised by this. Perhaps he thought it had been a strategic decision by the prosecution. O'Shea might have chosen not to take this route because he didn't know exactly where it would lead. He wanted to try Watts on the fact and send him to the death chamber. He didn't want to be responsible for opening a door to a possible insanity defense. Still, Bosch thought a psychological study could have been useful for understanding the defendant and his crimes. It should have been done. Whether the subject was cooperative or not, a profile could have been drawn from the crimes themselves as well as from what was known about Watts through his history, appearance, the findings in his apartment, and interviews conducted with those he knew and worked for. Such a profile might have also been useful to O'Shea as an edge against a move by the defense to claim his sanity. Now it was too late. The department had a small psych staff, and there would be no way for Bosch to get anything done before the interview with Watts the next day. In farming a request out to the FBI would result in a 2-month wait at best. Bosch suddenly had an idea about that, but decided to grind it over for a little while before acting on anything. He put the question aside for the moment and got up to refill his coffee mug. He was using a real coffee mug he had brought down from the open unsolved unit because he preferred it over styrofoam. His mug had come from a famous writer and television producer named Stephen Cannell, who had spent time with the OU unit while researching a project. Printed on the side of the mug was Cannell's favorite piece of writing advice. It said, "What's the bad guy up to?" Bosch liked it because he thought it was a good question for a real detective to always be considering as well. He came back to the cafeteria table and looked at the last file. It was thin and the oldest of the 3. He put aside thoughts of Echo Park and psychological profiles, sat down and opened the file. It involved the reports and investigation related to Watts' arrest in February 1993 for prowling. It was the only blip on the radar involving Watts until his arrest in the van with the body parts 13 years later. The report said Watts was arrested in the backyard of a home in the Fairfax district after a neighbor with insomnia happened to look out her window while walking through her dark house. She saw a man looking in the rear window of the house next door. The woman woke her sleeping husband, and he promptly snuck out of the house, jumped the man, and held him until police arrived. The man was found in possession of a screwdriver and charged with prowling. He carried no identification and gave the name Robert Saxon to the arresting officers. He said he was only 17, but his ruse crumbled and he was identified as Renard Watts, 21, a short time later when a thumbprint taken during the booking process scored a match in DMV records to a driver's license issued 9 months earlier to Renard Watts. That license carried the same day and month of birth with one change. It said Renard Watts was 40 years older than he had claimed to be as Robert Saxon. Once identified, Watts admitted to the police during questioning that he had been looking for a home to burglarize. However, it was noted in the report that the window he had been seen looking through corresponded to the bedroom of a 15-year-old girl who lived in the house. Still, Watts avoided any sort of sex offender jacket in a plea agreement negotiated by his attorney, Mickey Haller. He was sentenced to 18 months probation, which, according to the reports, he completed with high marks and no violations. Bosch realized that the incident was an early warning of what was to come, but the system was too overburdened and insufficient to recognize the danger that was in Watts. He worked the dates and realized that while Watts was successfully completing probation, in the eye of the justice system, he was also graduating from prowler to murderer. Murray Gesto was taken before he cleared his tail. "How's it going?" Bosch looked up and quickly took off his glasses so he could focus on distance. Ryder had come down to get coffee. She was holding an empty "What's the bad guy up to?" mug. The writer had given one to everybody in the squad. "Almost done," he said. "How about you?" "I'm done with what O'Shea gave us. I called evidence archives for the box on Fitzpatrick." "What's in there?" "I don't know for sure, but the inventory in the book just lists the contents as pawn records. That's why I'm having it pulled. And while I'm waiting, I'm going to finish up on Matrice and have it ready to walk over tomorrow. Depending on when we get to talk to Watts, I'll walk Matrice in either first thing or last thing." "Did you eat lunch?" "Forgot." "What did you see in the Fitzpatrick file?" She pulled out the chair opposite Bosch and sat down. "The case was handled by the short-lived Riot Crimes Task Force. Remember them?" Bosch nodded. "They had a clearance rate of like 10%, she said. "Basically, anybody who did anything during these 3 days got away with it, unless they were caught on camera. Like that kid who bricked the truck driver while a news chopper was right on top of him." Bosch remembered that there were more than 15 deaths during the 3 days of riots in 1992, and very few were ever solved or explained. It had been a free-for-all, a lawless time in the city. He remembered walking down the middle of Hollywood Boulevard and seeing flaming buildings on both sides of the street. One of those buildings probably contained Fitzpatrick's pawn shop. "It was an impossible task," he said. "I know," Ryder said, "putting together cases out of that chaos. I can tell from the file on Fitzpatrick that they didn't spend a lot of time with him. They worked the crime scene with a SWAT line guarding the place. The whole thing was pretty quickly written off as random violence, even when there was some stuff they should have routinely looked at." "Like what?" "Well, for starters, Fitzpatrick looked like he was a straight arrow. He took thumbprints off of everybody who brought in stuff to pawn. His edge against taking in stolen property." "Exactly. And what pawnbroker do you know of back then who voluntarily did that?" He also kept an 86 list. Customers who were persona non grata for various reasons, customers who complained or threatened him. Apparently, it isn't uncommon for people to come back in to buy back the property they've pawned, only to find that they are past the holding period and it's been sold. They get mad. Sometimes they threaten the pawnbroker, and so on. Most of this came from a guy who worked for him in the store. He wasn't there the night of the fire. So, was the 86 list checked out?" "It looks like they were going down the list when something happened. They stopped and wrote the case off as random violence associated with the riot. Fitzpatrick was set on fire with lighter fluid. Half the stores on the boulevard that were burned down were started the same way. So they stopped spinning their wheels on it and went on to the next one. There were 2 guys on it. One's retired and the other works Pacific. He's a patrol sergeant now. PM's watch. I left a message. Bosch knew he didn't have to ask if Reynard Watts was a name on the 86 list. That would have been the first thing Ryder said. You might have an easier time getting to the retired guy, Bosch suggested. Retired guys always want to talk. Ryder nodded. That's an idea, she said. The other thing is, Watts used an alias when he got popped in 93 on a prowling charge. Robert Saxon. I know you checked for Watts on the 86 list. You might want to check Saxon as well. Got it. Look, I know you have all of that going, but do you have time to do an auto track run on Watts today? The Division of Labor in their partnership had their doing most of the computer work. AutoTrack was a computer database that could provide an individual's address history through utility and cable hookups, DMV records, and other sources. It was tremendously useful in tracing people back through time. I think I can swing it. I just want to see where he's living. I can't figure out why he was in Echo Park, and it looks like nobody else has given it much thought. To dump the bags, I thought. Right, yeah, we know that. But why Echo Park? He lived closer to Griffith Park, and that would have probably been a better place for burying or dumping bodies. I don't know. Something is missing or doesn't fit right. I think he was going somewhere he knew. He could have wanted the distance. You know, he thought the farther away from him, the better. Bosch nodded, but he wasn't convinced. I think I'm going to ride over there. And what? You think you'll find where he was going to bury those bags? You turn psychic on me now, Harry. You turning psychic on me now, Harry? Not yet. I just want to see if I can get a feel for Watts before we actually talk to the guy. Saying the name made Bosch grimace and shake his head. What? Ryder asked. You know what we're doing here? We're helping to keep this guy alive. A guy who cuts women up and keep them in the freezer until he runs out of room and has to take them out like trash. That's our job. Find the way to let him live. Ryder frowned. I know how you feel, Harry, but I have to tell you, I kind of come down on O'Shea's side on this. I think it's better that all the families know and we clear all the cases. It's like with my sister. We wanted to know. When Ryder was a teenager, her older sister was murdered in a drive-by shooting. The case was cleared and 3 bangers went away for it. It was the main reason she became a cop. It's probably like you with your mother too, she added. Bosch looked up at her. His mother had been murdered when he was a boy. More than 3 decades later, he solved the crimes himself because he wanted to know. You're right, he said, but it just doesn't sit right with me at the moment, that's all. Why don't you take that ride and clear your head a little bit? I'll call you if anything comes up on the auto track. I guess I will. He started closing the files and putting them away. Well, there's the end of part 1, chapter 3. Stay tuned for part 1, chapter 4. Till next time, hit that, take care, hit that subscribe button, and like it up.